Hello, and welcome to our Health, Healing, and Spirit Conversations on Community Health Education. It's a series we're going to be having over the next few quarters, talking about individual health concerns that are of particular concern for communities of color, for Black and brown communities, and how our health impacts our overall life. We're going to be talking about several things in the context of this series over the next several quarters, from prostate cancer to breast cancer awareness and so many other diseases and illnesses that impact the African American community, the Hispanic community, and other communities of color at such an alarming and high rate. Today, we're going to spend our time talking about an extremely important conversation, health issue on prostate cancer. That's right. Prostate cancer. I know. No one wants to talk about the prostate. Men don't normally want to have that discussion, but trust me, you want to stay tuned and you want to hear everything that we're going to be saying about prostate cancer, about risk factors, about preventative measures, about how we can treat it, and what do you do if, in fact, you present with prostate cancer. So please, whatever you do not touch the dial. Stay tuned, because it is going to be a blessing for you and for your family. But before we begin, let me just give a strong welcome to all of our members and friends of our church, and those who are part of our larger community at large, those who are watching from the city of Atlanta, and those of you that may be watching from outside of the city. Thank you and welcome to our conversations on health. Let's ask the Lord to bless our time together as we spend time in this important conversation. Father, I thank you that you have called us to speak about those issues that impact the entire body, to talk about all things that are concerning with our health, both physical as well as mental and spiritual. And so we pray that in these conversations that we'll have, that you will be with us, that you will guide our discussion, that you will also give very solid and clear answers through each one of our panelists. And as we talk, we ask that you would be glorified. It is in Jesus' name we pray. Amen and amen again. Well, I want to once again welcome you to these conversations, and I want to share with you just a few things. One, we have a chat room that is going to be open, so right on the bottom or the side of your screen, you'll see a chat, and I'm encouraging you, as you are hearing and engaging in the conversations, ask questions as they come to your mind. We have professionals who will be on site in the chat rooms ready to answer your questions and to provide solutions. And if we cannot get you an answer, then we would love for you to give us an opportunity to find that answer and send it back to you. So please engage in the chats. And the second thing I want to ask you to do is to grab the man in your life that you love and bring him to the screen. Whatever you've got to do, bribe him if you got to do it. Bring him to the screen and invite him to listen to the information that's going to be shared today about prostate cancer and prostate concerns. None of us want to talk about it. I know I don't, but it is so important for us to not just talk about, but for us to give serious attention to. And so I want to encourage you to have the man in your life that you love at the screen watching this, if you would, no matter what the age, bring him that he might be able to learn this information. Let me introduce to you who our panelist is going to be for the day. We are blessed to have Dr. James Bennett. He is a nationally recognized urologist at Emory University, Midtown. And he is going to be sharing today in our panel. Also, our very own here at our church, Dr. Reginald Fowler. He is an internist at Piedmont Healthcare, and he's also a board member of NEWLIFE Community Ministries. And we are honored to have Dr. Fowler to share with us in our panel discussion today. And also Mr. Andre Stanton. Andre is a New Life Church member. He is also a prostate cancer survivor. He's an advocate for for prostate cancer awareness and prostate cancer concerns. He has an amazing story to tell us about being diagnosed with prostate cancer at a very young age. So we'll get an opportunity to meet him as well. But first, we're going to meet Dr. James Bennett. He is going to deliver a presentation, and I want to share with you a bit more about who he is. He's a world-renowned urologist who was on the front lines of the crusade to eradicate prostate cancer. He is the CEO of his own practice. It's called Midtown Urology, right here in the city of Atlanta, Georgia. He's been honored as the National Medical Association Practitioner of the Year in 1999, and he's a recipient of the coveted Nash Carter Award in 2014. He's an adjunct professor at Clark Atlanta University, which is also his alma mater, as a clinical assistant professor in the Department of Biology. He's also an adjunct professor at Morehouse and Emory University School of Medicine in the Department of Surgery and Family Medicine. And it is an honor to welcome Dr. Bennett to this conversation. So I'm going to turn it over to him, and let's give attention to the important information he'll be sharing about prostate cancer, and then we'll be right back.
Thanks, Pastor Harris. First of all, I'm honored to have to serve in this capacity on this very important discussion. Dr. Fowler has been a long-standing colleague of mine, and I'm anxious to hear Andre's testimony because we need men like him to step up. Because of his experience, I have made it a personal vendetta, if you will, is to educate the community about this very important disease. You'll notice from my topic of my discussion is what's new down there. Well, there is a purpose behind that. A few years ago, one of my closest friends, Kenny Leon, who is a award-winning producer and director on Broadway, came down with prostate cancer, and this is very public knowledge. And Kenny and I decided that we wanted to reach men in a capacity, much as I'm sure Pastor Harris wants to help men understand why they don't go to a physician. So the play is called What's Up Down There, and maybe at some convenient time we can host the play here because it will address many of the myths and the misconceptions associated with this disease. I always like to tell the story that men would rather brag about having a heart attack than the fact that he has prostate cancer. You know the reason why? Is a man does not want anything to erode his sexuality. And most men feel that by having a diagnosis of prostate cancer, that's what's going to happen. So they can brag about how many bypass grafts they had or how many bones they broke, but not prostate cancer. So hopefully at the end of this discussion, the audience will understand the importance of early detection, but also early intervention. And Dr. Fowler, I'm sure, will echo much of what I'm going to talk about. Just to put things in perspective for you, prostate cancer is one of the most frequently diagnosed cancers in the U.S. And actually, it's the second leading cause of cancer death. Unfortunately, the vast majority of these men are of men of color. We used to say men of African descent, but we now know it depends on where you fell off the boat, whether you fell off in the Caribbean or whether you fell off in Cuba, you still have that same gene pool, and we all have melanin. And you'll learn as we go into this discussion that melanin plays a very important part in the diagnosis of prostate cancer. Now, what you won't hear me talk about are symptoms, because men always come to me and say, Dr. Bennett, you told me I have prostate cancer and I don't have any symptoms at all. So how can I have this disease and I don't have any symptoms? Well, unfortunately, the symptoms such as a decreased force of stream, burning upon urination, blood in the urine, hesitancy, all of those are symptoms of an enlarged prostate, but none are specific for prostate cancer. So the message is really very simple. It's just like if you want your BMW to travel for 100,000 miles, you make sure that oil is changed and you make sure the tires are perfect. You have to do the same thing for your body. That is the most important thing a man can do. Now, one of the things that always comes up, if I'll see a young man like Andre in the office and I'll tell him, Andre, unfortunately, you have prostate cancer. And he'll say to me, well, Dr. Bennett, I'm healthy. Look at me. I'm slim, and I stopped eating pork and beef 2 years ago. Well, that's good that you became aware that those things are bad. But the battle with prostate cancer actually starts back in your late teens and early 20s, because 1 in 3 men of that age, regardless of ethnicity, already have cancerous changes, not cancer, cancerous changes within their prostate. And so there's a window of opportunity for everyone to create a healthy community and a healthy prostate. So it doesn't start when you're in your 40s and 50s and 60s. It actually starts in elementary school and high school. And the reason why is that's when those cancerous changes start. And then you add up on it the things that I just mentioned, the melanin in your skin, which decrease the absorption of vitamin D, something that Reggie and I have talked about for years, if not decades now, because we know that 70 to 80% of African Americans are deficient in vitamin D, and there's a direct correlation between the development of prostate cancer and having vitamin D deficiency. So that's how we need to change and address this disease in our community. Now, things like PSA, there's a lot of misinformation about the PSA, and it's true. The test stands for a prostatic specific antigen, which is a protein that is circulated in the blood, and depending upon the level of it, may indicate that a man has prostate cancer. Unfortunately, for most African American men, the cutoff for us is much lower than your normal cutoff for 4. Dr. Fowler knows this. He also knows another important figure, and that's called a PSA velocity, the rate of change of that PSA from 1 year to the next. We typically recommend for most men of African descent to have a PSA of no greater than 2.5, and that it should not increase more than 0.35 per year. So those are very important numbers. Digital DRE stands for digital rectal exam. We're not talking about a computer program here. We're talking about a finger inside of the rectum, feeling the texture of the prostate, looking for any subtleties that should not be there. Certain internists, again, like Dr. Fowler, I know does a very good rectal exam. So it is as important as the PSA. Why is that? Well, unfortunately for African Americans, many of us have very aggressive disease. And if we just go with the PSA alone, you may be misled. Sometimes those PSAs may be 1 or 1.5. Dr. Fowler reach in there and feel, oh, this area just doesn't feel right. Call me up, James, something doesn't feel right with this. And by and large, we biopsy those nodules, and sometimes those patients end up having very aggressive prostate cancer. So both of those things are very important. We use an ultrasound and a biopsy to get actual tissue from the prostate for the pathologist to examine. We also use additional tests, such as the PCA3, which is a type of tumor markers that is excreted in the urine, and a 4K score, which is a blood test that measures these similar type of tumor antigens that let the urologist know whether there's a high likelihood or a low likelihood on a biopsy that they will have prostate cancer. I think one of the more exciting things that we now have is the MRI, and these high-speed MRIs now can actually look at the molecular or the tissue makeup or the cellular makeup, if you will, of the prostate itself. And it, too, can indicate areas within the prostate that should be sampled upon a biopsy. The other advantage of the MRI, and again, we know that African-American men have more anterior tumors in their prostate, which means that you may miss some of these cancers on a routine rectal exam. So having the MRI to visualize this area will at least let the urologist know whether these areas need to be sampled with their biopsies. Once a diagnosis is made, we also have further tissue scrutiny, if you will, and we use such tests as the Polaris test, which the pathologist uses to look at the actual genetic makeup of the tumors that is seen under the microscope. Now, the Polaris test will tell the urologist that this patient has a high likelihood of having progression of his disease or a low likelihood of having progression of his disease. And those patients that have low likelihood of progression of their disease, then probably watchful waiting or observations would be the more appropriate method to manage that patient's prostate cancer. So always become educated about newer things like this that may help to improve and maintain your quality of life. Now, I won't spend a lot with treatment options because I think the most important thing is that you understand the pros and cons of each of these options, and that any honest treating physician, be it radiation oncologist or surgeon, should not only look at the survival based upon these various treatment options, but they also should talk about the quality of life. Because if you ask me, James Bennett, if you had prostate cancer, would you take 15 years of quality life over 20 years of miserable life? I'm the first one to be in that 15 years of quality life every time. And what I mean by that is the lack of loss of control of water or the ability to remain intimate with the significant other in my life. Now, finally, these are some of the things that we all need to be doing, not only as an adult, but your children as well. The sooner you can get the animal fat out of your diet, that means the beef, that means the pork, that means the dairy, because a lot of people don't realize that dairy has a lot of animal fat in it, but it also has a lot of calcium. And we have to be careful with calcium because calcium may add to the aggressiveness in some men with prostate cancer. I'm not saying you don't need some calcium, but there are other ways that you can get natural forms of calcium. And again, Dr. Fowler, I'm sure at some lecture of his will talk to you about the very important aspects of nutritional intervention. But you'll see vitamin D as part of this recommendation. Most people now should have a vitamin D checked. I would probably recommend it in children as well. We also now know that even though Reggie and I have been talking about this for years, we now know that having levels of vitamin D in the range of 50 to 60 may even provide, or does provide, protective effects against COVID-19. So the healthier you get, and the things I'm talking about, helps us with all of those other diseases that disproportionately affect our neighborhood. These are just certain groups of these of foods and fruits and vegetables, and most of this stuff is available. But we just have to get the fast food burgers out of our diet. Those tasty, crispy French fries. We need to avoid all of those things and incorporate these types of food products into our lives and the lives of our children. Now, finally, every man likes a joke, and this is a joke where I always advise my men to relax. And in this particular cartoon, he says, Herb, see what happens when you don't relax? My graduation ring is up in there because his anal, sometimes guys come in, the anus is so tight, you can't feel anything. So, Pastor Harris, on behalf of all of the men of Atlanta, I appreciate the opportunity and look forward to any future discussions you may have.
Thank you so much. Come on over and join us. And while Dr. Bennett is being seated, I just want to reiterate to everyone watching, the men or the man in your life that you love, please go get him or go get them. Call them up and tell them to tune in. Get them in front of a television screen or in front of a computer screen and watch this broadcast. The information that we just got finished hearing is extremely involved and detailed, and I want to say it's frightening, and it is frightening. It's frightening for men like myself when we know we're not doing what we need to be doing in terms of our diet, in terms of getting checked, in terms of awareness, in terms of monitoring those risk factors, and that can change. Your health is just as important as your mental clarity, as your spiritual vitality. Your physical health is just as important. We want you to be around for a long time. So please go get those men, sit them down. Let's have a serious conversation about prostate cancer. And to begin it, I guess I want to hear a personal story. Brother Andre Stanton has such a riveting story about prostate cancer and about how it has impacted his life and impacted his family's life. And so, Andre, can you just share with us what happened and walk us through this journey, because I know it was a journey that you were on.
Yes. Thank you so much, Pastor, for the question. Before I begin, I would like to tell Dr. Bennett how riveting and informative your presentation was. Being an individual who has gone through this, I've learned so much by the information that you shared, so I really appreciate that. I'd like to begin by saying that I was diagnosed with prostate cancer at the age of 40, and I can recall at my routine physical that I, had gone to while I was yet 39, and, kind of joked with my primary care physician that, hey, doc, next year's the year. And of course, I was referencing the prostate exam that was featured in the illustration of the presentation. And so my primary care physician helped me, through that, telling me that it was nothing that I really need to be anxious about. It doesn't take a long time. In fact, you can have it today if you like. And certainly I wasn't prepared for that. But I actually did have it during that particular visit. And he was right. It didn't take, a long time, thank God. And after the exam, he shared with me that my process appeared to be enlarged or larger than it should have been for my age. And so at that particular time, I'll be honest with you, I felt like I was doing all the right things. I, was not overweight. I worked out probably 5 times a week at that time in my life. I was a part of 2 flag football leagues. I was very active, had a lot of energy, and I didn't feel as though I had any symptoms. But it turned out that I did have symptoms, many of which were what I consider to be hiding in plain sight. And what I mean by that is, because I was so active, I drank a lot of water all the time, even to this day. And so me using the restroom frequently didn't appear odd. I kind of associated one with the other. You drink a lot of water, you go to the restroom a lot. It made sense to me. One thing that kind of stood out to me as it relates to the symptoms that I experienced was frequent urination during the course of the night. Didn't quite understand that. Or having a sense of urgency, meaning that as I'm sitting right now, I would be fine, but the moment I got up, I had to find the nearest restroom quickly. And, I didn't associate that, of course, with something like prostate cancer, but of course, kind of moving back to my provider, he said that, well, we're going to have your PSA levels test, which is a blood test that they use to determine, your prostate and what's going on there. And so the results of that were, again, higher than they should have been for someone of my age. And so my primary care physician encouraged me to, well, he wrote me a referral, but he encouraged me to go. And I'll be honest with you, and Dr. Bennett kind of pointed it out, I wasn't going to go. I felt fine. I didn't feel like it was necessary. I felt like, to be honest with you, it was a waste of a copayment because I didn't hurt or anything like that. And so it really was because of the relationship that I had with my primary care physician and the fact that when I saw him again, I didn't want to say that I didn't go. I said, you know what, I'm just going to go. Have a consult. What can be the pain in that? And so I'm so glad that I did. And I had an opportunity to, meet the urologist. And then when I went there, they took my PSA as well. It was the first thing that they did. And it turned out that my results were higher than they were the first time. And I think I might have gone maybe within 30 days from that visit. And so they said, well, my urologist said that's not uncommon. Sometimes people have a condition called prostatitis, which is an infection of the prostate. They'll prescribe an antibiotic, and that usually clears it up. And that was pretty much the conversation that I had. And so it sounded good to me. I'll take the antibiotic and come back to see you, and, we'll be through with this. And so when I came back after, taking the antibiotic for about 10 days, took the PSA test again, and my PSA levels were higher than the first 2 times. And so we moved forward with treatment options. Of course, biopsy, we got to the point where I needed to have a biopsy to test the tissue, and we did that. And it really was at that point where it was determined that I had early stages of prostate cancer. And I did not expect that. I was 40 at this time. I did not expect that. It literally rocked my world. At the moment the urologist said, because I was there, here to get my results, it was just me. When the urologist says it has been determined that you have been diagnosed with prostate cancer, the urologist continued to talk after that point. But I will be honest with you, I heard nothing beyond that. As he was talking, I was in my mind seeing my health decline. I'm just being very honest with you. Seeing my health decline, seeing all the things that I felt like I would no longer be a part of, like seeing my children not graduate from high school or college for that matter, not being a part of their wedding ceremony. And in the same visit, I envisioned my funeral. You know, mentally, I was not in a good place on that day, as you can imagine. I was young, I was doing well professionally, and, you know, I felt like I did all the right things. And it just so happened that I was diagnosed. And so what I did at that point, I began to educate myself. I began to find out more about this condition that the provider says that I now have. And a part of that education process is me reaching out to members of my family. My father died before this time. And so I reached out to his brother and his brothers and, you know, my uncles on my mother's side of the family. And I began to ask questions such as, you know, I told them about how I had been diagnosed, and I asked them, had they ever experienced anything related to prostate cancer? And these were about 6 or 7 separate conversations, and each of them privately told me that they had. I was not aware that it was a part of my family history. And of course, providers all ask you that all the time. I just didn't know. And so I was, it was startling, to say the least. And so once I understood that this is now a part of my family history, I began to take those symptoms seriously. And I would have been more proactive, not blaming, but just saying, had I had that information ahead of time, I would have taken more seriously getting up during the night and, you know, urgency and things of that nature. And so upon educating myself, also my diet, I had to make some changes there. Even though I was active, I love hot dogs. I have to be honest with you, and I always have. And so, and not to say that I do not enjoy an occasional hot dog, but I had to incorporate things like broccoli, things that were high in antioxidants, tomatoes, fruits like, tomatoes and grapefruits and watermelons. So I had to incorporate things into my diet so that I can begin to start doing things that would help me. Another thing that was I guess a pain point for me, and Dr. Bennett mentioned it, was that I loved milk. I loved cereal. I grew up on it. And so I would drink a lot of milk, thinking I was doing the right thing because milk has calcium. Some milk, vitamin D, right? It does a body good. And so I thought I was doing the right thing, but I did not understand the adverse effect that it was having on my prostate. And so
I want to, first, I want to just say it's by the grace of God that you made it past that.
Amen.
This was on a whim. You were at the doctor and you just so happened to have the conversation about getting your prostate examined. Then you were diagnosed with prostatitis, I think is the name of it. Is that prostatitis? Okay. I knew I would get it wrong. But you were diagnosed with something that you did not have, but you had symptoms that was related to it. And if you did not go back to the doctor after taking those 10 days of antibodies, you would have had cancer growing in your body, and you would have been unaware that it was growing in your body. So it's the grace of God. It is also your obedience and a desire to take care of your health. I got to admit, though, that all of this is scary. All of this is a bit concerning because it's not the way that men normally think. There are some startling statistics. 1 in 7 men that have incidences of prostate cancer or die from it is going to be an African American man. That we are twice as likely to die from prostate cancer as other ethnic groups. That's pretty scary. Dr. Fowler, why is that, and what can we do to mitigate those numbers, to change that?
Well, first of all, I'd like to just again echo what Andre said about Dr. Bennett's presentation, and also, Andre, your presentation was superb as well. And thank you for sharing this information with our guys out there who really need to know about this dreadful disease. Let me talk about the good piece, the good part. And the good part is that if we detect this early enough, then many of these people will have what we in medicine call a 5-year survival, which means that's what they use for every disease, a cancer, of almost 97%.
Wow.
So that's the good news. But the key is detecting early. And, so many great things have been said. I was in the office last week with a patient, brother's former NBA star, came into my office, and he's in his upper 30s. And I've always made it a point in my office to check the guys at 35 and above with rectal exams, okay? Because I know about the aggressiveness of this disease. I know how it's more frequent in the African American community. So I've done that. And when I talked to him, he's, "No, doc, I'm not doing that." Okay, that was his attitude. I didn't force him. I just said, okay, I respect your opinion, but understand what I'm saying, that this is a disease that we need to be ahead of. And the only way we're going to be ahead of it is to combine our exam on the rectum and prostate along with the PSA test. So unfortunately, he agreed not to do that. Now, that's not the first time that's happened. I'm sure James can tell you the same thing. Dr. Bennett and I have been dealing with this for a long time, and I think out of all the patients I've sent him who have turned out to have prostate cancer, I can think of 1 death in 40 years.
Wow.
1 death.
Wow.
And I remember that guy's name, James. Okay, share with you later. Yeah. 1 death. But that's because of jumping on things early and being aggressive with this diagnosis. Now, what can we do to prevent this? Yeah. What can we do to prevent this? And I think some of it's already been said when you talk about diet first. Diet is very important. When you look at the Mediterranean diet, and many of you out there can Google the Mediterranean diet, you'll find that that's a diet that consists of fruits and nuts and veggies, and also olive oil and poultry, limited red meat, and red wine. That is an anti-inflammatory diet. And I think when we're dealing with prostate cancer and many other cancers and diseases in general, one of the main things we have to look at is inflammation. Inflammation is what triggers a lot of these diseases, okay? And if you get on a program where you are eating foods and drinking liquids that are anti-inflammatory, then you are less likely to have the disease. And if you get it, it's not going to be as aggressive. Now, James, Dr. Bennett and I have talked about vitamin D for over 10 years before people were really talking about it much as it relates to prostate cancer. What is it with vitamin D? Well, vitamin D, here's the deal. As Dr. Bennett said, many African Americans or people of color tend to be low in vitamin D, and that's because of the melanin he mentioned, the pigment in our skin, which doesn't allow the rays that come from the sun to get through the skin as well as they should to create vitamin D, because we make our own vitamin D. So the bottom line is this. Generally, you're going to be deficient. And this is also in Caucasian Americans too, very frequently too, I've found it. If you look at the northern part of the United States, where there's low vitamin D levels, Michigan and so on and so forth towards Canada, you'll find that
temperatures are normally
absolutely
cooler there.
Yeah, but there's not much sunlight, so you tend to find that those people are low in vitamin D as well. Even autoimmune diseases sometimes we feel are triggered by low vitamin D, so there's a lot of more autoimmune disease in that area, okay, of the country. You look at Florida, a place like Florida. Florida, you would expect, people to have high vitamin D levels because of all the sunlight. Well, it turns out when they did a study on Florida several years ago, people actually had low levels because they put on their sunscreen, which blocks the rays to create the vitamin D. So what's the deal with that? So we need the sun. So the bottom line is, if you're going to go out in the sun, go out for about 10 minutes, then put on your sunscreen, okay? And then follow the directions, because now in most of the bottles they're telling you when to reapply it, okay? So that you won't get issues from the sun causing skin cancers, okay? So at the bottom line with vitamin D, and vitamin D is extraordinarily important, and Dr. Bennett alluded to the fact that now COVID, we think there was some data that came out of Europe recently that showed that as they're looking at this data with COVID, people who really got sick with COVID, many of them had low vitamin D levels. Wow. So it is protective. It is a part, we believe, something that strengthens our immune system. So if it's low, you're going to get inflammation, and COVID loves inflammation. And once it gets at you and you're already inflamed, and this is what we see. I predicted this 4 or 5 months ago about obesity. Let me just stop here, just talk about this for a second, because obesity, not only is it bad in terms of prostate cancer, okay, because of the inflammation that you get from obesity, but also with COVID. And now you're hearing the data come out about COVID affecting obese people more so than people who are not obese. So inflammation is a huge, huge problem. Obesity, just to talk about that for a second, if you measure around your belly button as a guy, and that belly button is 40 inches or more, well, guess what? You've got a lot of inflammation going on in your belly, which creates issues. It's the belly fat sends out inflammatory proteins, which cause everything from cancer to heart disease to strokes, okay? Wow. In a woman, 35 inches or more, okay? So the guys out there, the ladies out there with these bellies, hear what I'm saying and heed the warning. You've got to do something about that. So the best way, as already has been mentioned, we've got to eat better, we've got to exercise, which has not been mentioned much except when you used to do it, and it didn't matter, unfortunately in your case, but it probably did. It probably did, because if you weren't doing that, you might have had a worse case, okay? So the bottom line is, eating appropriately, the cruciferous vegetables, the leafy vegetables, and yes, you can eat your collard greens, just don't put the fat back in there and the ham hocks, okay? All right, that's okay.
Is that collard greens if you don't put fat back in ham hock in it? No, I'm just playing, I'm just playing.
Kale, broccoli, as you mentioned already, all of these are antioxidants. People talk about tea, green tea, antioxidants. All these things need to be incorporated in the diet. Now, alcohol was kind of mentioned. I think I heard, maybe I heard it, maybe I didn't. But alcohol in excess obviously is not good. We think that also relates to developing prostate cancer. However, there have been some studies about red wine and prostate cancer. And red wine, I think one study I saw was about 4 times a week seemed to decrease the incidence, if not decrease the aggressiveness of prostate cancer. Now I'm gonna say one more thing, and that is black folk, and Dr. Bennett can talk about this too, and that has to do with when you rank prostate cancer. He taught me this, okay? Something called a Gleason score, okay? And James and I have talked about this for years. This Gleason score, that magic number 6 always pops up in my head because that's when it's supposed to be not very aggressive. But there's some recent data that show in African American males that even low Gleason scores may be aggressive. So I'm going to stop there.
I have tons of questions. My mind is just spurling. Are there true genetic issues connected with prostate cancer and African American men? Is there a genetic contributing factor to this?
Well, classically, you hear that hereditary prostate cancer probably comprises about 10%, but some of that is old data. It's very interesting to listen to Mr. Stanton because one of the things he talked about, and is one of the problems within our community, is that there's very little discussion about our diseases that have a tendency to run in our families. And certainly I think that is one of the most important messages that I have learned from doing years and years of community outreach. Usually if multiple generations within your family have any cancer, but in this case prostate cancer, most men in that family, it's not a matter of if they're going to get it, it's a matter of when. Sometimes, Pastor Harris, it's very difficult to separate what's hereditary, caused by your genes, and what's familiar. What's the difference in the terms? Hereditary means that your genetic code predisposes you to form that disease. Familiar means that there may be diseases that run within your family, but it may not be tied to your genes. It may be tied to the fact that you eat the same foods, you're exposed to the same air, you're exposed to the same soil, you're exposed to the same water. And you're exposed to similar stress because you're under the same household. So there is a very important part for familiar diseases as well. But the important thing is that we don't have the absolute number. But the important thing is we have to learn our family history, because in your case, if you had known as a little kid that my uncle or my grandpa died from prostate cancer, you may have, or your family may have said, well, Andre, maybe we shouldn't be taking you to get a Big Mac. Maybe we need to be giving you some collard greens without pork in it. Or maybe we need to have your vitamin D checked at age 6, 7, 8, and 9, because that's the time, and you hear us talk about antioxidants. Reg is absolutely right about the inflammatory nature of disease. But free radicals that develop just by the fact that we're breathing oxygen. Free radicals are substances that are poisonous to our body. And one of the important things about these antioxidants is they bind these free radicals. And by binding the free radicals, it forms water. And so the water obviously is less toxic than the free radicals. So it all plays to the biochemistry and the makeup of your body. So the more you know, and the earlier times you can instill these changes in your family during those childhood years and those teenage years, it's going to pay an impact. It'll pay its dividend 40 and 50 years later.
Absolutely. There are other factors, obviously, that explains why African American men are impacted by prostate cancer and prostate disease much more than other ethnic groups. And a large part of that has to do with the quality of care and the level of professional information that many physicians give to the patient when the patient is before them. By that I mean, I get checked at the doctor often. I go to physicals. I know that I've never had my physician to share with me any of these risk factors, even the nutritional risk factors. Certainly not that I'm African American and I'm in a higher risk group. The issues that you guys just got finished sharing, is that also a part of this problem? And that is physicians and providers providing the right information to the patient if the patient is African American.
Well, I think it's across the board. And I think that this is a problem oftentimes when the doctor is pressed, because oftentimes he or she doesn't have enough time to talk about these things because they have to move on to see the next patient. The other piece of this might be just the lack of adequate education when it comes to nutrition. Dr. Bennett touched on something very important, free radicals. These are something, as he said, we breathe in the air for sure, and we also get them from bad food. And free radicals drive disease, okay? So the antioxidants that have been mentioned from plants and fruits and veggies and all of these things counteract those free radicals and neutralize them so that hopefully you won't end up that way. It's interesting, but every day we get 10,000 hits on our DNA and our cells by free radicals. 10,000 hits. So there's going to be at least a mutation or two developing. So does that mutation mean you're going to get cancer? No, but if your body's immune system is where it's supposed to be in terms of the strength, then hopefully that won't happen.
How do we prevent the free radicals from having the devastating effect that it has to our cells? What can we do to prevent it? Because you can't not interact with it.
Yeah.
So how do you prevent it from having the devastating effects that it has?
The only thing you can do really is what we've already talked about, is lifestyle. And that is eating more plants, eating more fruits and vegetables, which are full of these antioxidants that neutralize these particular free radicals. In the plants, there's something called phytonutrients. Okay, and let me give you an example of something. An apple has over 10,000 phytonutrients. Phyto, P-H-Y-T-O, means plant-derived. Okay, has about 5% vitamin C. Okay? Now, the interesting thing is the phytonutrients act as antioxidants, which neutralize the free radicals, which is what we're trying to do to prevent disease.
Right.
Vitamin C is an antioxidant. It also neutralizes them. Unfortunately, what happens so oftentimes is that people will take vitamins, multivitamins, and think that that's satisfying this equation. Unfortunately, that does not happen. If you take that vitamin C out of that apple and put it in a vitamin or take it by itself, it's not going to have the same effect as the phytonutrients plus the vitamin C in the apple. And that is why I tell my patients all the time, that's why I always hear, if you increase the amount of fruits and vegetables in your diet, then you're going to decrease the incidence of cancer and heart disease and strokes. Have you ever heard if you increase the amount of multivitamins in your diet, the same thing happens?
So I want to make sure that we say this very clearly.
Right.
What we are saying is that vitamin supplements, though they can be good, they are not highly recommended for this conversation in terms of cancer prevention and eradication. You are suggesting that we do the actual fruits and vegetables more so than taking a pill of vitamin C or taking a pill of vitamin D. Fruits and vegetables and out in the sun.
Whole food nutrition is the way to go, if possible.
Whole food nutrition.
If you can't, then if you have to take a supplement, you have to take one. But if you can get the whole food nutrition, that's the way to go, except for vitamin D now. As I want to emphasize that, you're just not going to get enough vitamin D in your food. It's just not going to happen.
So that is out in the sun, or that is supplements as well?
Both.
Both. Okay.
Both. Yeah. Okay.
Right. Understood. So I do want to ask one final question as it relates to this whole issue of prevention. Diet is important for prevention. Taking the vitamin D supplements as well as being out in the sun, important for prevention. Getting screened is important for prevention. The big question that I have is, what is the age? What is the age that a man should begin the screening process of having his first rectal exam?
Dr. Bennett.
Yeah, my recommendation is this. I think every patient is different, and that's what experience in medicine will teach you. No same instrument fit every patient. In Andre's case, who he now has realized that his family has multiple generations of a disease, in this case prostate cancer, men like that probably need to have a contact with a physician as early as 30 or 35. Not necessarily saying that he needs a PSA, but depending upon how strong that family history is. Just to put it in perspective, over the years I've seen a multitude of men with a significant family history. I've diagnosed prostate cancer as early as in a man who's 32. He unfortunately had a very aggressive prostate cancer. School teacher in South Fulton. He was dead by 35. And so it's a hard question to answer, Pastor Harris, but I certainly agree with Reggie. There's so much misconception or just men just are so afraid. I don't know whether it's homophobia or whatever it is, but his example of the professional athlete is not uncommon. But again, I have gotten to the point in certain patients to refuse to see them as a patient because I feel that is irresponsible for me as a urologist. It's just like you going to see a cardiologist and the cardiologist doesn't listen to your heart. I feel the same thing with the rectal exam, and it's that important. So, but we do run into that commonly, and so what I would recommend is probably for all men of African descent, certainly to start by 40. But if you have a significant family history, I would say 35, and if it's really, really significant, maybe as early as 30.
One of the things that is a concern that I have, and I'm sure many other men have, is trying to understand the role that the PSA test does, that PSA number. When you gave your presentation a bit earlier, it sounded as if you were saying the PSA is a very good test to do, but it is not in and of itself all that is necessary to be done. I'd love to understand why is that? Why can I not just have you draw my blood, check my PSA? If the number is decent, then I'm good. Why do we need to go through the additional screenings?
Well, being on the front lines before they get to Dr. Bennett, I will tell you my thoughts about that. And I've been through this process now for many years, and the bottom line is this. The reason why, and I think Dr. Ben already alluded to this, you need to do both. You need to do the digital rectal exam, you need to do the PSA, because both of them can individually be normal, but you can have prostate cancer. So in other words, you can have a normal PSA, have prostate cancer. You can have a normal prostate exam, have prostate cancer, the PSA is high. Okay?
Yeah.
So you've got to combine both. And also, I can't overemphasize the fact what Dr. Bennett mentioned about, and what Andre mentioned about family history, how all this plays a role that adds to that as well, okay? But that's the bottom line. I've felt prostates that, where you might feel something the size of a grain of salt. When you do this enough, his fingers become that sensitive. And PSA being normal, but yet this grain of salt, I call up Dr. Bennett and say, James, and he knows this, I think you need to look at this person because I'm feeling a little something here that is the gland is not totally smooth. I just feel a little something different. He biopsies and there's a prostate cancer.
From something, from that kind
Absolutely.
of rise or that kind of texture.
Exactly.
You could sense that this is an abnormal. And there's no other way that you would know that that grain of salt or that irregular texture is on the prostate.
That's right.
Unless you're doing a digital rectal exam.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's correct. And unfortunately, it's the rectal exam that sometimes is the most resistant and fought against by most men. And I'm sure Andre can tell you that as well.
Absolutely. And there is reservations, and, just speaking very candidly, and I can't speak for all men, but in my case, it was the sense of, it not being comfortable, maybe a sense of violation, if you will, for some, and like you kind of alluded to earlier, it might in your mind feel like you're, being less than a man if you have that type of exam, because it's an humbling experience. I'm not gonna, sugarcoat it, but it is. But I'm grateful that I did have the exam because I would have waited a whole nother year, like Pastor alluded to, and then there could have been a lot of other things that took place within that time frame. And I know that we're still talking, prevention, but because I did that, both the PSA and the rectal exam, it was detected at an early stage. And because of that, there were several treatment options available to me that might not have been available to me had I waited that additional year.
Okay, so I understand risk factors. I understand prevention. I understand the change of lifestyle that needs to happen. Unfortunately, I understand the digital rectal exam is important and necessary to be done, no matter how uncomfortable it is. This is not about your masculinity. This is about your life. This is about keeping your life healthy for your spouse, your children, and your grandchildren and generations to come. What I want to do now is I want to talk about the actual diagnosis itself. If, in fact, I am diagnosed or someone is diagnosed with prostate cancer, what next?
Well, what you learn with experience is most men, as Andre's experience was, is that when you walk into a room and you tell a patient you have prostate cancer, most men are like a deer in front of a headlight. And I've always, after a biopsy, encouraged the significant others that are with the man to be present at that discussion, because the man is not going to hear anything. Even though I have a nice informational package, it's traumatic, and they start looking for reasons to justify why the information may or may not be correct. Women, the man's significant other should be in those appointments, because once it is diagnosed, it is important for anyone receiving such news to realize this is not a death sentence. Most of us, when we hear a diagnosis of cancer, we think of death. With the newer, innovative type of therapies and interventions we have now, as Dr. Fowler initially referenced earlier, is that we rarely see cancer deaths, particularly if patients are compliant and they follow the physician's recommendations. what happens is once a diagnosis is made, the pathologist looks under the microscope and he looks at different patterns these cancers make. And it's almost like looking at 5 different types of flowers. A rose looks different from a daffodilly, which looks different from a tulip. And each of those 5 different patterns are given numbers, and those are called Gleason's grade. And so what typically happens is the pathologist looks and says, what do I see the most of? Oh, I see a tulip. And if the tulip has a Gleason grade of 3, that's the first number. And then the next question, what do I see the second most of? Oh, I see the same flower. So that's a Gleason score of 3 plus 3, which gives you a score of 6. And so the scoring system goes from a low score of 2, which is a non-aggressive cancer, to a high score of 10, which is a very aggressive cancer. Unfortunately, most African Americans present with those higher grade tumors, particularly if the diagnosis is delayed. The most commonly diagnosed cancers in the U.S. are Gleason 6. But in African Americans, most of our cancers, many of our cancers are 7s. And unfortunately, many of our cancers are underestimated because we, as urologists, sometimes fail to appreciate the anterior portion or the portion of the prostate that's furthest away from the biopsy needle. We know that African Americans harbor more of these anterior tumors, and which are the more aggressive ones. And so that is why it is so important to understand the disease itself, and you mentioned earlier about the internist and the importance of that internist, because internal medicine, your primary care physician, should have that rapport with his patients. And as you did with your patient, and as I know that Dr. Fowler has. And so it's by the communication between physicians, such as what I'm explaining to you now with these Gleason scores, it helps the primary care physician to better counsel patients in terms of their options, in terms of their evaluation and the rationale behind. A very important example of this is we know that the more deficient you are in vitamin D, for an example, if your vitamin D levels are less than 20, you are a setup for getting those Gleason 7, 8s, and 9s tumors. So the worse you are from a deficiency of vitamin D, the more aggressive these cancers are. So it is very important that the primary care physician and the specialist communicate these things, because they manage the general body. I take care of specific things. Mm-hmm. So what we do based upon these Gleason scores, it mandates certain tests that are done to determine the extensiveness of these tumors. And those tests are things like bone scans, because prostate cancer preferentially like to go to bone. And we also do MRIs looking for enlarged lymph nodes and things like that. And once we get all of that information, in addition to things like I mentioned earlier, the Polaris test, which lets us know that even within Gleason 6 tumors, that some of these tumors are still more aggressive than your regular run-of-the-mill Gleason 6. And that may mandate a form of evaluation and treatment that you wouldn't necessarily know by the Gleason score itself. So that's what happens, Pastor Harris, when a diagnosis is made. We have this discussion about nutrition, because the strength of the immune system is so important. The traditional things handles the acute situation, but long-term survival is tied to all of the things that Dr. Fowler talked about. Your immune system. How do you improve your immune system? You eat these foods. You get rid of these foods, the processed food. That's one of the things that the hot dog is processed. And so the processed foods, the dairy, the animal fat, all of that stuff needs to go or be significantly reduced. So, Reverend, that is what happens at the time of the diagnosis. This information is shared with the families. And so I generally try to have the entire family of those people that the patient feel that are important decision makers, and usually it's the wife, to come in and to participate in the discussion. And then they're the one that generally keep the man on the right path.
Is it common for doctors and medical providers to have this level of conversation with a patient, to suggest things like those MRIs, the bone scans, and those things? Or do you have to be diagnosed with prostate cancer first before you start having those conversations? And I know this is a multifaceted question, but are most medical providers equipped with the education to have the conversations that we're talking about now?
Well, I think usually if there's any question that the person might be at risk for having prostate cancer, then we automatically send that patient to the urologist. And the urologist is going to talk to them about the different modalities that Dr. Bennett already mentioned with MRI, et cetera, et cetera. I know there's some newer things they're looking at. You might, James, want to comment on this urine spermine and all this sort of stuff, so you may want to comment on that. I know I've read something about that. Another way to possibly diagnose, also some other tests that might allow you to avoid the MRI that are out there now too. But that's all kind of speculative stuff in my book, but he probably knows a lot more about it since he's a urologist. And I think once Dr. Bennett has gathered up all that information by screening the patient to see if this thing is spread to the bone with the bone scans, et cetera, then that's when he decides on the best treatment for that particular Gleason score and whatever else the cancer might have, well, where it might have traveled to, if it has at all. And then that's where the treatment comes in. The other thing that I know that he taught me years ago was, because many times when guys get prostate cancer, they'll say, I want it all out. Take it all out. I don't want any of that in me. Nothing. Get it out of me, doc. And they'll tell,
He's got cancer
they'll tell
in it.
him that, right?
Take it out of my body, right?
And I think that, Dr. Bennett can do that now. He can do that. But I think one of the things he taught me is that when guys get in their 60s, and if you do remove that prostate gland, then sometimes you will be incontinent of urine. In other words, you may have to wear a diaper.
Yep.
Yeah.
And because the floor of the pelvis, the muscles aren't as strong. Yeah. And he, that's something he shared with me years ago. Yeah. So something to know.
Yeah. So treatment options are, of course, removing the entire prostate, which is not recommended if it's not necessary to be done.
Well, I think we generally over-treat prostate cancer, and I'll be the first as a provider to say that. We also sometimes, as providers, we look at numbers and says this is a cure. 90 is better than 89, or in terms of survival. Or this group had 90%, this group had 89. But then the distinguishing discussion will be the quality of life. And we talked about that earlier, because I think if you have an honest discussion with the man, because there is no right or wrong answer, Professor. If any surgeon, radiation oncologist, hematologist, oncologist tell you that this is the best treatment, they're blowing smoke up where. There's never been...
Where your prostate is.
Yes, where your prostate is. And so there's never been a randomized study to prove that. So what I've learned over the years is I don't make decisions for patients. I go through option 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. This is what I have most experience with, and this is the outcome based upon my experience. Now, I look at the couple in the family, and I look at them because every couple is different in where they are in their marriage. I will tell you first up, most women are not interested, or not, it's not as important as what most men are interested in, and that's the sexual part of that's associated with prostate cancer. Most women are most concerned with intimacy, and there's a big difference between intimacy and what most of us think as intimacy. Intimacy for most women is being able to caress her at dinner, to hold hands, and that's intimacy. And sometimes, depending upon where patients are and couples are in their life, that's the most important thing with women. What most men don't appreciate with treatment of prostate cancer is the most important thing that's going to impair the quality of your life. And Reggie just said it. And that's loss of control of urination, and it's called incontinence. I can't walk in this room and say to you, Pastor Harris, you can't get an erection. But I can walk in this room and tell you whether you're leaking urine. Why? Because you're going to smell like urine. And so that is the thing that changes quality of life. And so when I have a discussion with patients and families, I make sure they understand to separate those two. And most people at the end of this discussion will say, well, you know, Dr. Bennett, yeah, you're right. You're right. I don't want that. I go to church every Sunday, and no, I don't want that procedure. If you're telling me I'm going to be leaking urine, quality of life is important. And I put both up on the same pedestal.
So let's you alluded to it. So I'm going to go all the way there. Let's talk about sex. Let's talk about sex. Does a diagnosis of prostate cancer mean that your sex life is now over?
It depends on what you mean by sex, and I just tried to separate that for you. For women, no.
For the man?
For the man, no either.
Okay.
But most men won't accept the fact that they're 70 years old or they're 65, and they universally think that they're still in their 20s and 30s. Oh, doc, you know, before this came down, oh, man, yeah, I had to do it 3-4 times a day. And the wives, you have the wives there, they'll say to you, now, honey, you know that's not right. Now, and
It went with me, right?
Yeah, it went with me. And so we know that that's not true. And so most men just will not accept the fact that their sex life is not as grander as they think it is at the age of 60 or 65. And that's just a fact of it. But your erections will not disappear with appropriate treatment of your prostate cancer. All of us at a certain age, depending upon how fit you are, what you're eating, what all your general health, all of us are going to have some diminution, if you will, in our performances. And so that's why it is so important for you to do the things that Dr. Fowler has talked about. Because at the end of the day, it's having healthy blood vessels. It's to decrease your inflammation. All of the things that we're talking about to prevent prostate cancer, at the end of the day, these things will improve your health, which then will improve your sex life. Absolutely. So that's how it's all tied together.
Andre, you were going to say something.
Yeah, Pastor. I wanted to kind of jump in here. Well, first, I had a Gleason score of 6 when I was diagnosed as well. And so after that, remember I told you how I didn't hear anything else. I went home. I had to ride home. I had to figure out, how do I now disclose? Because it was not even anything that I was really concerned about. I was going through it, but I wasn't really concerned about it. And so I had to, of course, open up to my wife. I have a wife and 4 daughters, and I didn't even know how to engage in this type of conversation. And so I did, of course, share with my wife what was going on. And then so when I came back for what they call a multidisciplinary visit, where they would provide you with every option available to you. They would have a surgeon come in, like Dr. Bennett said, who, of course, if you have prostate cancer, we remove the prostate, you no longer have cancer. However, lifestyle is a very important factor, because the risk or the side effect could be I will be now 40 in a diaper. I had to ask myself, is that something that I want? And quickly, I can share with you that was not
what you want.
That was not an option. It was more aggressive of a I guess an option than it needed to be for my type of cancer or my stage of cancer. Active surveillance was another, meaning that you just observe it, watch it, and then we'll come back and we'll see if it's gotten, progressed or not. And that too was not a good option for me, because mentally I was, I just couldn't wait. I felt like I needed to take an action of some sort, and I ended up having what they call brachytherapy, which is an outpatient procedure where they implant radiation seeds. The urologist can speak more about that, but and that seemed to be the option that I was most comfortable with. I had my wife and my mother. Those are the only 2 people that I shared at that time about what was going on. And they were with me because I was afraid I was going to not hear again, and I needed somebody who could share and provide me some additional details, and somebody that I could trust that would help me in making that decision. Because this is, I was told by my urologist that this is not a decision that you can make here and then you can come back and make another decision. It was, you have to find the right decision for you and for your lifestyle and for your family. Of course, I'm young. My wife and I, still wanted to be intimate and things of that nature. And so I had to factor all of that into my decision-making process.
And so we've spoken about, of course, prevention. We've talked about risk factors. The portion regarding the unique particularities of African-American health and environment I thought was just important. The genetic predispositions of African-American men to this disease, I thought was also very significant. We've talked about when you are diagnosed, what treatment options are there available. We had a brief conversation about lifestyle, and this is incontinence and sex, both, and they're important to African-American men and families. And so we also alluded to the importance of having a good relationship with your primary care physician, where these kinds of conversations can be done, and you can talk with them, ask the right questions, and they can give you great support. Do you recommend having not just a PCP, but also having a urologist that you see, or do you recommend only seeing a urologist once you are referred to them by your primary care physician?
Let me just speak to one thing that has not been said, and to answer your question immediately, I would say it depends on who the primary care physician is.
Understood.
Okay, if it's Reginald Fowler.
Not necessary.
No, not necessary.
If it's a primary care physician that hasn't had this level of conversation
Correct.
with you,
Right.
you might want to go talk to your
Correct.
urologist.
But I think there's a bigger issue that I want to bring up before you, Pastor Harris, and your congregation, and it has to do with disparities. There's been, and this is old data, is that if you look at even the going back to the 60s and 70s of a practice that's called redlining. And for those of you who are not familiar with redlining, it has to do with banking practices and how these banking practices were discriminatory depending upon your zip codes and where you live. Those same red line areas are the areas where that is unfortunately are the where most of the health disparities are, and it's all economics. But the point I'm going to bring up here is that data has shown that patients, particularly patients of color, whose care is provided by people who look like them, they get better care because of that relationship. And I don't care how smart a person is, but science is only a small part of being an excellent physician. The bigger part is the art of medicine. And what we do know is that those providers who provide care to people who look like them, and Reggie, you can speak to this, generally those patients receive better care. Reggie?
Yeah, well, yeah, you're right. And there was a study just done this past year that addressed that. It was a national study. Showed it beyond a shadow of a reasonable doubt that actually happens. It's all about cultural, relationships. I was involved with a pharmaceutical company several years ago. I was on the board to try to make these cultural relationships occur across the board in physicians, no matter what their color. We actually put together a program that it was initiated in New Jersey to try to enlighten providers about cultures. Mm-hmm. And it didn't last long, okay? Mm-hmm. It didn't last long at all, unfortunately. But it's hard to teach that, yeah. Okay? It's hard to teach that. So I think what Dr. Bennett said is exactly right. Oftentimes, let's face it, folks who look like you, you're going to gravitate more towards them oftentimes because we all share the same pool, yeah. And whether it's the same gene pool or what have you. I know we talked a little about genetics already, but there's no question that's reality. Yeah. That's reality.
It took us a minute to get there, and I'm glad we have. I think that the message I would want for those who are watching this to know is that your provider has to have a personal connection to you, your lifestyle, your environment, your experiences, and your culture. And that means a lot. There are clearly some unique issues, health issues, that African Americans face that other ethnicities don't face to the same degree. I've learned one today that I haven't heard before, and that is the melanin in the skin impacts vitamin D absorption. Given that, or vitamin D creation, but given that as a fact, you're more likely for an African American doctor to communicate those needs to you and those concerns and particularities to you than you would in other doctors. Now, to be very clear, it doesn't mean others won't.
That's correct.
It doesn't mean others won't. We are not saying that at all.
No.
But what we are saying is that the likelihood of a shared culture does increase the possibility of you hearing these kinds of conversations that you may not normally hear if there isn't that commonality of the culture. Is that what we're saying?
Absolutely. And the data bores this out.
And the
most
data,
of
of course, does bear that out.
Yes.
There's been concerns about health insurance, about getting insurance plans to understand the particular needs that African American men would have in the area of prostate cancer and adjust the payment rules accordingly. And so this would mean that since African American men are at a higher risk of prostate cancer, that there should be some consideration from insurance companies that will allow and pay for certain screens and treatments and et cetera earlier on than you would in other cases. And we hadn't quite gotten there yet, is what I'm understanding, is that we're not quite at that stage yet. So would you recommend that you can't wait until the insurance company says, we'll pay for an MRI, or we'll pay for an exam, or we'll pay for a special screening, that as an African-American patient, you have to take that into your own hands and press that issue because it may not be on the docket for the insurance company to state that? Would you recommend that?
Yeah, and I think, this has been an ongoing problem where the mass of data that's collected on diseases, oftentimes minorities fall into the massive data instead of having separate data for that minority. So this is something we've struggled with, James and I, all these years we practiced. What do you do? How do you get around that? And it's tough sometimes. So you have to be a little creative sometimes and just try to get the test done for your patient. That's all you can do. And, there's ways we can be creative in medicine if we know that there's a need. And I always like I talked about this the other day in a conversation just briefly, and I don't want to deviate too much, but about colon cancer. And, for years, colonoscopy is recommended at age 50 for everybody, okay? However, African Americans would usually get it much earlier. More morbidity, more mortality from colon cancer. But yet the insurance company said 50 years old, screen everybody. Well, about 5 years ago, the American College of Physicians and Surgeons said, let's drop the age down for African Americans, finally, to at least 45. They said that, but it still wasn't really instituted in the insurance companies. But this past year, when all of a sudden data started being collected in white Americans, all of a sudden they said, oh, well, white Americans are getting colon cancer at a younger age now. Let's drop it down. Now the insurance companies are saying do colonoscopies everybody at 45 years old. So PSA, the same thing applies.
Yeah.
Correct.
We're struggling with this.
Yeah.
And, James and the groups that he sits with and the urology groups, and they fight for this all the time, I know. He can probably shed some light on that for you because James has been at this for a long time about disparities in testing.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, we may have to leave it there, but I think that begs a part two to conversations like this because the disparities piece is a significant piece. Whenever you are not approved for the test, it's because data specific to your ethnicity was not considered in the decision-making process. And that is a significant challenge. Takeaways. Number one, prostate cancer, know your risk. Know your risk. If you are if it's a part of your family or a part of your genetic background, ask the questions in your family. Know your risk. Know your diet. Know your nutrition. Know the risk that you're at. Make the lifestyle changes. Now, number 2, know your number. This is your PSA. Get the number and have the digital rectal exams regularly. That is a major, major issue that we don't like doing, but it can save your life. It can save your life. And then number 3, know your provider. Know and develop a relationship with your professional medical provider whereby there is a cultural connection, and these kinds of comments and advice and counsel will have a lot more sensitivities there if there is a cultural connection. We're not saying it doesn't happen with a Caucasian provider. We are not saying that at all. What we are saying is that the likelihood of you having a cultural connection is higher if you have a provider who shares the same cultural experiences as you do. So I want to give some last comments. And Dr. Bennett, if you would have one final thing you want our audience to know, what would that be?
The one thing that from 30 years or more of practicing and being involved with the community that I've learned is that most people have this wrong idea about prostate cancer and when it should be addressed. And I've done community outreach for years through an organization that's called CHAMPS, and usually it's men our age that show up there. I've been trying to get guys in their teens and 20s. I've tried T.I. and many other local celebrities to help bring out the younger population. So the message that I would like to leave is parents and grandparents, don't lose this opportunity to affect the survival of your children and your grandchildren. Teach them the importance of exercise and good nutrition as early as elementary school.
Dr. Fowler, same question. What would you want our listeners and viewers to know?
I'd like to echo some of that, especially as it relates to nutrition and what you should be doing. One of the problems that people of color have oftentimes in our communities is that we are surrounded by the fast food places.
Yeah.
And they're there for a reason.
Yeah.
We've got to get away from that. We've got to understand that, unfortunately, those are the kind of vehicles that are heading us down the path.
Yeah.
We have got to understand that a lot of what we get is about what we do to ourselves.
Yes.
Okay?
Yes.
And we can change that. Yeah. There have even been studies that show that you can probably change your genetic expression if you consume the right things, even as it relates to vitamin D that's been looked at. You might be able to turn that gene back the other way so that it doesn't give you that problem. That's called epigenetics. So again, I think it's so important for us to understand that we have to get smarter. We have to watch out for what's happening now. Do you realize right now over 40% of the United States are obese, and we as black people have rates even higher than that.
Yes, sir.
And the prediction by 2030 is that 50% of the United States will be obese. Yeah. And obesity is a killer, and it helps drive the disease that we're talking about today. So again, it all relates to what can we do more to benefit ourselves. And I would just encourage people to understand that we can make changes, even if it means just adding one piece of fruit a day you didn't do yesterday. That's going to decrease, you'd be surprised, what that does in terms of decreasing your mortality against certain things. So that's my message.
Real quick, it was stated earlier about redlining and the practice that was used to actually create slums and ghettos, that it was a systemic practice over time that created disproportionate housing values, disproportionate housing ownership in African American communities, and drove many urban African Americans into the slums and ghettos. That same idea is with the fast food restaurants. It's an economic concern that in African American communities, you're going to find a lot more Mickey D's, a lot more Burger Kings, a lot more fast food restaurants, less healthy food options. And we have to take it upon ourselves to intentionally eat healthy. work out, exercise, do the things we need to do, because in our community and in our environment, it's not going to be as prevalent. So that message rings loud and clear. Andre, what would you like for our audience to hear as someone who has survived this process? What would you want our audience to hear in your closing remarks?
Amen. So I would like to admonish younger African-American men to not ignore the signs or symptoms. If you have any of the symptoms by which you've heard, whether in conversation or through the presentation, please don't ignore it. And I'd also like for our younger men, or just our men in general, to overcome their fear and anxiety of seeing a physician. Overcome that barrier of the prostate exam, or if you know that you need to lose weight and you don't want to go to the provider till you lose weight. I've heard that before. So just overcome the fear and the anxiety that you have, because as a part of being a leader and being there for your family, I mean, we have to lead in the area of health as well. And so I would encourage and admonish them to do that.
Gentlemen, this has been a very engaging and informative conversation. I just want to give a strong thank you to each of you for being a part of this experience. Dr. James Bennett, thank you so much for being a part of this.
Thanks, Pastor.
Dr. Reggie Fowler, cannot
pleasure.
say thank you enough for sharing. And Andre Stanton, thank you for being a part. I just want to mention to you that if you have spent the time to listen to this conversation, then you know how important it is, and I know that you learned a lot from what you've just heard. This is going to be on our website. It's going to be on social media platforms for a while, and so I'm going to encourage you to please call the people in your life that you love, men specifically that you love, and get them to go to YouTube, to our YouTube page, and pull up this conversation and watch it, even if you only watch portions of it. Watching some of it is better than watching none of it. The second thing I want to encourage you to do is to send in those questions. Our providers will be online for just a little bit longer. If you have questions that you'd like to ask, please type them into the chat rooms, and we'll be certain to get you some solid answers back from it. And the last thing I want to encourage you to do is to take care of your health. We do a lot to take care of our spirit. We read the Bible, we study the Word, we spend time in prayer, we have daily devotion, we attend worship services, and all of that feeds our spirit, man. And it is critically important that you feed your inner spirit. But if your physical body is unhealthy, or if you are obese, or if you are not eating right, or if you have lack of energy, or if you are candidates for a high risk of diseases like cancer and others, then a weak body can't do much for a strong spirit. You need a strong body to match a strong spirit. You have a lot more living to do, a lot more loving to do. You have a lot more life to experience. Live it and experience it at the optimum level of your health. And that's what these conversations are about. That's what these discussions are for. And I pray that you will take advantage of this information. We just want to give a strong thank you to partners in this process, to the HEAL organization. Thank you so much for helping to partner with us, as well as Amgen. Thank you for partnering with us to get this message and awareness out. As always, I love you. I love everything about being your pastor and serving you and showing you not only the way to God, but also the way to a better life. And so God bless. We'll come back together again and talk more in our health, healing, and the spirit conversations. Until now, God bless. Bye-bye.